By 1993, Square had firmly established itself as a pillar of the Japanese video game industry, with Final Fantasy being recognized as the second biggest RPG series in the country, behind Enix's Dragon Quest. And series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi was looking to expand the series beyond its traditional genre conventions and into the strategy subgenre. Unfortunately, his time and attention would be monopolized by the main, numbered Final Fantasy games. It wouldn't be until 1995 when development of such a spin-off would finally begin. But as was now the case with the main series, it wouldn't be Sakaguchi in the director's chair. Instead, development would be led by a newcomer to Square, one who had just finished directing a landmark title in the genre before joining the company, Yasumi Matsuno. With Matsuno at the helm, Final Fantasy would not only successfully break into the strategy subgenre, but would produce the most celebrated spin-off in the franchise. Born on October 24, 1965, Yasumi Matsuno would grow up in a remote part of Japan's Niigata prefecture, where his options for entertainment were somewhat limited. He would read manga and watch television, especially during the winter months when he was barricaded inside by up to 3 meters of snow. His favorite stories were ones which left extraneous details to the imagination, allowing his mind to expand on and enrich it. Like many of his contemporaries, the original Star Wars would be one such film to pique his interest this way, but he much preferred fantasy epics like Conan the Barbarian and The Lord of the Rings. His love of literature and fantasy would be nurtured by his family, with both of his parents having their own collections of books, and his otaku older brother regularly buying genre fiction for him. This interest in details and stories would manifest in his love for dioramas, which he tended to base on World War II photographs he would find at the library. Matsuno had sought to do more than reproduce those images. He wanted to expand on them to tell a story through the finer touches. To him, they were more than facsimiles of historical events. They were a living, breathing world. Matsuno's desire to create would brush up against his education. After finishing high school, he would move to Tokyo to study foreign policy at the prestigious Hosei University, as he had developed a great interest in international affairs. Despite his major, his passion still lied in the arts, and he would participate in a film club during his time at the university, where he would practice writing scripts. During this time, he also found work as a part-time writer, but he would also develop his passion for video games. His free time would often be spent at the arcade, playing games like Pac-Man and Gradius. It wouldn't be until 1986 that the idea of buying games directly would cross his mind, using money from his writing job to buy a Famicom, a disk system, and The Legend of Zelda. Not long after that, Dragon Quest would command his attention as well. Both Zelda and Dragon Quest worlds were well-defined, yet open-ended. They each had their own rich histories bubbling beneath the surface, with scattered hints as to what they were like before their respective downfalls laden throughout their writing and design. It was inevitable that Matsuno would fall in love with them. He wanted to pursue his creative passions, and these games added plenty of fuel to his fire. After 3 years of study, Matsuno would drop out from the university to write full-time, and while reporting on the economy would put food on the table, he wouldn't find it very fulfilling. But his time working within tight corporate boundaries wouldn't temper his creative desires. Meanwhile, a fresh game development studio, Quest Corporation, was seeking new talent to help set them apart from the competition after having recently rebranded itself. Matsuno would join the company in 1989 in an effort to tell stories through video games, and despite his inexperience in the industry, would be put in charge of development for the Famicom platformer Conquest of the Crystal Palace, which would be released in 1990. Matsuno would begin to hit his stride with his second game, 1993's Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen, a real-time strategy game for the Super Famicom steeped in player choice, rich history, and moral ambiguity, wrapped in a high fantasy setting. Despite the niche genre appeal, Matsuno believed that it was necessary to stand apart from the likes of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and this assertion proved to be correct. The game was well received and sold over 400,000 copies in Japan, and while it was only granted an initial shipment of 25,000 units in North America, where it had been published by Enix, it proved just popular enough for the publisher to continue ordering more after selling out. This success would continue with the release of a sequel, Tactics Ogre: Let Us Cling Together, in 1995, which disposed of the real-time aspect of its predecessor in favor of a turn-based gameplay system, while also exploring morality in times of war. Matsuno had been moved by the then-current Croatian War of Independence, which had seen the Republic of Croatia fight for their right to establish themselves as a sovereign nation independent of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was a conflict foreign to those living in Japan, not just geographically but ideologically. It had given rise to the term ethnic cleansing, and Matsuno wanted to portray this specific form of tragedy to an audience that he thought was largely unfamiliar with it. Tactics Ogre would sell over 500,000 copies for the Super Famicom, and between the two Ogre titles, Matsuno had become a venerable figure in the Japanese video game sphere, garnering a reputation as someone who not only knew how to use the medium's unique attributes to their fullest, but in doing so was able to craft a truly literary work of art. But rather than continue to ride the success of the Ogre Battle series, Matsuno would depart from Quest following Tactics Ogre's completion, as the company's staffing issues had begun to stifle him. In trying to determine the next step in his career, he would happen upon an advertisement for a job at Final Fantasy and Saga developer Square, and as luck would have it, he was just the kind of person Hironobu Sakaguchi was looking for. As the Final Fantasy series started to garner greater praise and recognition in the early 1990s, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi had also begun to take notice of the works of Yasumi Matsuno. Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre would be among his favorite games of the era, and it was his interest in the strategy RPG genre, combined with the massive success of Final Fantasy V, that would spur him to create a design document for his own Final Fantasy-branded take on the genre in 1993. During this time, he would even register the trademark for the title, Final Fantasy Tactics. Unfortunately, because of the quickening pace of development for the series, he had to put the Tactics project on indefinite hold. It wouldn't be until 1995 when Sakaguchi saw an opportunity to grease the wheels on Final Fantasy Tactics. Yasumi Matsuno, who had recently left Quest, applied for a job at Square, and Sakaguchi was more than eager to bring him into the fold. He recognized Matsuno's talent for storytelling, and knew that having the man behind the Ogre Battle series at the helm of Final Fantasy Tactics was an opportunity that could not be passed up, and Matsuno was eager to fill the director's chair on the project from the moment he heard about it, bringing two key members of the Ogre staff with him from Quest, art director Hiroshi Minagawa, and character designer Akihiko Yoshida. While Sakaguchi would present Matsuno with his old design document for Tactics, he would ultimately discard the producer's ideas in favor of his own take on Final Fantasy. Part of this vision was for it to be a real-time strategy game, like the original Ogre Battle, but this direction would be left behind by May 1996, by which point Matsuno had devised a turn-based system in the vein of Tactics Ogre. However, unlike with the Ogre Battle series, Matsuno did not intend to write the story this go-around, instead wanting to focus on the battle system. This wouldn't come to pass, however, as Final Fantasy series veteran Hiroyuki Ito would be assigned to Matsuno's team. While Ito had been part of the story team for 1989's Makaitoshi Saga, or the Final Fantasy Legend as it was titled in North America, the bulk of his work was in game design, particularly battle systems. At that point, Matsuno knew that it wouldn't make sense to create the battle system himself, and passed it off to Ito. But he wouldn't be able to do the same for the story due to staffing issues, leading him to once again pen the scenario himself. Matsuno saw the Final Fantasy series as a morality tale adventure story, and wanted the story of Tactics to fall in line with that. But as he spent more time at Square's offices, the story began to shift with how he viewed his workplace. Quote, "There were individuals there who were like royalty. Their talents and the social capital they had amassed, it made me doubt whether someone without those gifts could ever succeed there, no matter how hard they tried." End quote. Among those Square royals was Hiroyuki Ito, who Matsuno thought of as being the greatest genius in the company, but working with him wasn't the smoothest experience. Ito wasn't a fan of strategy games. He found the micromanagement that seemed inherent to the genre to be dry and monotonous. He couldn't bring himself to finish them, and while he would use this personal distaste for the genre as a motivator to craft a system that he personally would find engaging, this personal ethos would find itself slightly at odds with Matsuno's vision. Notably, Ito wanted to reduce the complexity of the game's job system, and Matsuno wasn't willing to compromise. But while Matsuno's own feelings about the idolatry within Square's walls would seep into his writing, Final Fantasy Tactics would be influenced more by the world outside Japan, just like Tactics Ogre before it. But whereas the latter was directly inspired by the Croatian War of Independence, Final Fantasy Tactics would be more abstractly inspired by the seemingly eternal tug-of-war between religious and secular rule. Much like the conflict in Yugoslavia, this point of reference was something far outside the periphery of most Japanese citizens, but Matsuno found it fascinating. As development on Tactics wore on, so too did development of Final Fantasy VII, but unlike 7, Tactics was aiming to have a more reined-in visual style, driven by a more stripped-down, hand-drawn look befitting its more grounded story. And to accompany this simplified aesthetic, there was a concentrated effort to make the game more approachable to newcomers to the genre. Considering the meteoric success of Final Fantasy VII both in Japan and abroad, this was a smart decision. Interest in the Final Fantasy series was higher than it had ever been, meaning that expectations for Tactics would have similarly been high, and the appeal of its branding was possibly even higher. Whether Matsuno wanted it or not, Final Fantasy Tactics would be riding the coattails of Final Fantasy VII when it was released in Japan on June 20th, 1997, and in North America on January 28th, 1998. Long ago in the land of Ivalice, the Lion War saw the kingdom divided over who was the true heir to the throne. While the official history is that the fighting was quelled with the appearance of a warrior named Delita Hyrule, the recently uncovered Durai papers assert that the youngest son of House Beowulf, a would-be knight named Ramza, was the true hero of the story. For hundreds of years, his involvement in the war was covered up by the church, who had branded him a heretic. But thanks to the Durai papers, his story may finally be told. It's shortly after we're thrust into the story, in medias res, that we learn that Ramza already knows the would-be hero Delita, who kidnaps Princess Ovelia from Orban Monastery on the orders of Prince Galtana as part of his political machinations. The first of the game's 4 chapters takes place a year before the princess's kidnapping, and shows that Ramza and Delita were once close friends. In fact, Ramza's father, the respected knight Balbain's Beowulf, had adopted both Delita and his sister Teta when their parents died of the Black Plague. The late Balbains even arranged for Delita to join Ramza at the military academy in Garaland, much to the shock of the dean, since it's unusual for commoners to be given such an opportunity. The two had stayed as close as brothers while at the academy, but in their attempt to save Marquis Elmdor of Limberry from a peasant army called the Death Corps, they had begun to not only face the horrors of war, but the class divide between the common folk and the aristocracy, how the latter use the former as a means to an end, and think of them as little more than tools. This culminated in the Death Corps taking Teta hostage, believing her to be a Beowulf, and Ramza's brother Zalbag giving the order to kill her while still in the Death Corps' hands, to show how far they're willing to go to preserve their place in the world. Delita would seemingly die in an explosion while cradling his sister's body, and Ramza, disgusted with his brother's callous disregard for human life and the idea that it's anybody's rightful place to be used by someone with higher social standing, leaves the academy and abandons his family to become a mercenary. But Delita's reappearance prompts Ramza to abandon his mercenary work to pursue his estranged friend, leading the two of them to separately but simultaneously fight the forces of the two princes vying for the throne, the church manipulating both sides of the conflict, and a demonic enclave which is slowly ensnaring all of them. That is the super condensed premise of Final Fantasy Tactics. While the core of the story is actually fairly simple, its scope and the number of plot-critical characters can make it somewhat difficult to keep track of it all, at least at first. A lot of names and titles are thrown at you with just barely enough context to make sense of it, all with varying importance. Some of them will go unseen and unmentioned for long stretches of the narrative before popping back up with new narrative significance, such as with Marquis Elmdor. Thankfully, it seems that Matsuno was keenly aware of how sprawling the cast was, as there's a glossary, The Brave Story, available to read at any time on the map menu. It not only includes background information about the many, many players in this story, but also a section recapping the story mission by mission in case you're in need of a refresher. This large cast is in service to the game's world. Despite only being a single country compared to the entire planets traversed in the main series, Ivalice feels so much more tangible than just about all of them, thanks to just how carefully considered everyone's places are and the history they all share. The kingdom only recently came out of the 50 Years' War with its neighbors, and as the king lies on his deathbed, there's a power struggle brewing over who will ascend the throne. It's a conflict which affects everyone regardless of class, but the ones who stand to lose or gain the most are the nobility. After all, those who are in good standing with whoever becomes king will surely see preferential treatment. The commoners, however, likely wouldn't see any tangible difference in their lives, regardless of whether the throne is held by Prince Larg or Prince Galtana. All that would change is whose banner they fight and die serving. The particulars of the conflict between the two, respectively represented by the crests of the white and black lions, are complex, to say the least. In fact, they aren't even princes, despite being referred to as such in the English script. They're dukes, each with their own paths to the throne. Larg is the brother of the widow Queen Ruvelia, who bore 3 sons for King Omdoria, though the first 2 died tragically young. After the death of his second son, the king adopted his half-sister, Princess Ovelia, as a potential heir, with the council supporting this decision out of a distaste for the queen. As it turns out, they were the ones who had the king's first 2 sons killed, specifically to prevent her from becoming Ivalice's regent when the king inevitably dies. However, his third son, Prince Orinus, would be born soon after, throwing the inheritance of the throne into question. The king sent Princess Ovelia to be raised by Duke Galtana of Zeltenia, who would have her brought up in a monastery. Meanwhile, Queen Ruvelia would name her brother, Duke Larg of Gallione, as the guardian of the infant Prince Orinus. Because both Ovelia and Orinus are too young to ascend the throne, if either were chosen, their respective guardian would become regent in their stead. But if something were to happen to one of them, then the other would be next in the line of succession by default. This conflict leads to just about all of the nobles across Ivalice assessing their standing and taking sides in what ultimately becomes the Lion War. This includes Ramza's family, the Beowulfs, who stand with Duke Larg out of continued loyalty to the throne, as well as the eldest brother, Dystarg's personal friendship with him. But here's the kicker. Neither Larg nor Galtana have any guiding principles driving them in pursuing the throne. Like the aristocrats taking sides, all they want is power, and they're willing to do whatever's necessary to secure it for themselves. It's this insatiable lust for power that allows the Church of Globados to easily push the two sides to thin each other's ranks, all in the hope that the Church can fill the resulting power vacuum. If the people's confidence in the crown falters from the bloodshed of countless thousands fighting in the name of whichever noble's vanity, then the Church can step in to mediate and court favor with everyone regardless of class. And these machinations go even deeper, as the Church is being used as cover for a cabal of ancient demons, the Lucavi, to enact their own rule over Ivalice through possessing various members of the nobility and the Church. Truly, there is a lot going on in this plot. There are layers here, and if you're a fan of stories which deal heavily in the politics of war, then Final Fantasy Tactics definitely has you covered. For me personally, it felt like a bit of a tangled web on my first go-around. Not unintelligible by any means, but it definitely requires some effort on the part of the player to keep pace with what's going on, and to refer to the provided glossary if necessary. The only real low point in the story for me was the reveal that Ovelia isn't actually the princess, but her double. The real Princess Ovelia died tragically young, but she, the double, was raised in her stead for political purposes. It's initially presented as earth-shattering for her, leaving her despondent and questioning whether her life actually has meaning, but it's quickly dropped, and she continues to play the part of a princess. It's not that the idea of her being a double is inherently bad, but nothing is done with it past a couple of scenes. If the revelation were to be excised from the story, nothing about it or her character would really change. It's a shame too, because I like Ovelia. Having been raised in monasteries, with Ramza's younger sister Alma being her only friend growing up, she isn't accustomed to a life of opulence and doesn't have a craving for power like her various family members. In fact, she's distressed over the fact that so many people are dying for her sake, whether to kill or protect her, and openly wishes that she wasn't born a princess. Now granted, she does get that wish when she learns she isn't the real Ovelia, but again, she's still treated as though she were, and she doesn't experience any kind of growth as a direct result, so nothing fundamentally changes. It does, however, reveal the gentry as hypocrites when it comes to status, class, and the divine right of kings, a struggle which opens the eyes of both Ramza and Delita, the game's core protagonists. Ramza and Delita come from two different worlds. The former is the son of a respected knight, while the latter is a commoner who was adopted into Ramza's family when his parents died of plague. Over the course of the first chapter, we get a firm grip on just how strong their friendship was before Teita's death, and how their respective worldviews are changed when confronted with the ugly side of war and the class divide. Despite his station, Ramza was an idealist. He believed that there was no problem that couldn't be talked over, and that everyone, regardless of class, is equal. Delita largely held the same principles, but when the two of them set out to save the Marquis of Limberry from the Death Corps, a band of peasants frustrated by the aristocracy's callous disregard and abuse for commoners, they're forced to grapple with some harsh realities and worldviews. This quest is incited by a squire named Algus, who they rescue from the rebel faction. Along their journey, Algus is quick to torture captured enemy combatants and dismiss any notion of equality between the classes. That commoners like Delita are inherently lesser, subhuman even, and only exist to be used by the nobility. That it's their proper place and they can't escape that no matter what. He even suggests that Ramza is using Delita in some way, which angers the young Bay-Elf. But it also opens both of their eyes to the cruelty of the gentry and why the Death Corps even exists. So long as the noble class remains, they will do anything to maintain the status quo of so-called lowborns and highborns. Neither Ramza nor Delita is in a position to really do anything about this either. Not only are they squires in a military academy, which is a position achieved almost exclusively by nobles, but their being members of House Bay-Elf acts as a signal to those around them of what team they ought to be playing for. When Ramza attempts to talk down Miluda during a skirmish, she's apoplectic over the idea that a Bay-Elf would ever attempt peace talks, declaring him her enemy based solely on his name. The boys' experience with the Death Corps, up to and including the group's ultimate defeat at Fort Zeekden, led to the two of them leaving the academy. Ramza became a mercenary, taking his commoner mother's name to hide his identity, and Delita would become a rogue element, joining up with various groups over the course of the narrative to further his own goal of class liberation. In the brief moments when the two cross paths early on, their relationship is tense. They aren't sure where the other stands in the grand scheme of things. Ramza still considers Delita a friend, and while we get the occasional scene of Delita without Ramza, it takes a bit of time for it to become clear that he also still trusts Ramza. It's difficult not to read this as a loose parable for Yasumi Matsuno's feelings about working at Square. Similar to how Ramza is the youngest son of a noble house, Matsuno was a well-known game developer with certain expectations set upon him for what he accomplished at Quest. He was seen as the strategy game guy, the genius behind Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre. Quest had something on their hands thanks to him. When Matsuno joined Square, he brought a handful of Ogre's core development team with him, but he was still a stranger in a strange land. Hironobu Sakaguchi knew and respected him, of course, but the way that Matsuno described working at Square during the game's development gives the impression that he wasn't very well known there. Of course, the way I'm describing it here can make it seem like hubris, but when looking at the sales figures for both the Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy series at that point in time, it's clear that there was a wide gap between them. Matsuno's works didn't have the same level of financial success as those helmed by Akitoshi Kawazu, Koichi Ishii, Hiromichi Tanaka, or, of course, Hironobu Sakaguchi. They were Square's golden children. They amassed that social capital, and their works had catapulted Square to the point where they could spend tens of millions of dollars on Silicon Graphics workstations before the console for which they were making their biggest blockbuster yet had really proven itself. Matsuno was left to prove himself again at Square just as he had at Quest, but like Delita, he was going about it in a way that made more sense to him. In Matsuno's case, it was through the genre that he was expected to make. Where Ramza and Delita diverge is in how they go about practicing their ideals. Ramza believes in honor, something his father instilled in him, and so isn't willing to cross certain lines if he doesn't have to. He believes in peace and justice and aligns himself more with the common man than people of his own class. But after Delita reappears and he begins to catch wind of the church's plot, he stops hiding his identity and tries to be diplomatic with other nobles, often to no avail. It's Ramza's above-board methods and idealism which see him branded as a heretic, giving the church's shrine knights, who are largely being manipulated or controlled by the Lucavi demons, carte blanche to hunt him down and execute him. By contrast, Delita, while still holding the same goals and ideas as Ramza, has adopted the belief that the ends justify the means. It's how he's able to work towards his goal without drawing the ire of the church. He has no qualms with killing if necessary, but he doesn't relish it. Truthfully, it can be difficult to get a beat on Delita's headspace and goals for large swaths of the game. Part of this may be because Matsuno originally wanted the story to be told from both of their perspectives simultaneously, but this was unfortunately scrapped early on in development. Thankfully, after Delita realizes that Ramza is staying true to his ideals, any ambiguity regarding where the two stand with each other is assuaged. The two rarely fight side by side during the story, but they still help each other by sharing information and working towards a common goal. Ramza isn't the only person Delita is shown to have a bond with, however. Intermittently, we are treated to scenes where Delita begins to form a bond with Ovelia, pledging not only to protect her life, but to burn down the kingdom and build a new one fit for her rule. She doesn't totally believe him at first, but time and again he proves his devotion to keeping her safe. He even allows Ramza and Agrias, Ovelia's personal guardian, to bring her to Zeltenia in his stead as a show of good faith to them both. But even still, there's an uneasiness to Delita's promises, leaving it ambiguous whether he truly wants her to be queen, or if he's just using her the same way he's using the church and Galtana. Both Ramza and Delita, at their most basic level, are easy to understand and sympathize with, and they're both deeply entwined with the game's core theme of class struggle. Delita is doubtlessly more complex than Ramza, owing to his pragmatism brushing up against his ideals, but Ramza's straightforward character and philosophy act as the game's anchor. Regardless of whatever curveball is thrown into the plot, I was able to stay invested because I liked Ramza and wanted to see how he would overcome whatever would get in his way. Giving him a personal stake in the conflict by having his ideology clash with his brother's, and having his younger sister Alma get kidnapped by the Lucavi only strengthens this. The latter is obvious, but the former not only emphasizes the rift between Ramza and other nobles, but also gives the player something to chew on regarding his upbringing and the kind of person his father was. On his deathbed, Balbanes told Ramza to never shame the Beowulf name or tolerate injustice, that living true to one's heart is not just their family way, but the way of the warrior. Balbanes expected Ramza to become an honorable knight and loyal servant of the king, just as Dystarg and Zalbag had. Ramza clearly takes his father's words to heart, which leads him to rail against the nobility. He's seen firsthand the injustice that's inflicted on the lower class by those of higher status, and will not tolerate it. But when other nobles see that he's basically defecting from the gentry, they comment on how he was probably spoiled by his father, or that he's a disappointment. A disgrace to the Beowulf name. Even his brothers veer into this territory, and while Dystarg and Zalbag say they see Delita and Teta as siblings, they don't seem to have an issue with letting the latter die if it means bringing down a threat to their power. Ramza's brothers muddy the waters further regarding their father's character based on their actions and motivations. Assuming Balbanes raised them all with the same values and principles, each of the Beowulf boys interpreted his philosophy of being true to oneself, preserving honor, and fighting injustice in radically different ways. Ramza prioritizes fighting injustice, being true to his own beliefs and honoring his family name by helping the downtrodden. Zalbag would honor the family name by being a loyal knight, fighting injustice against the throne of Ivalice and House Beowulf, and Dystarg would be true to himself in the most heinous way, by playing the long game in an attempt to take the throne for himself. He slowly poisoned his own father to become the lord of House Beowulf, and would murder Duke Larg, his own friend, when he finds him on a battlefield late in the story. Of course, he argues that he's doing this to honor House Beowulf, that their father never had the stones to take advantage of an opportunity like this, but like the rest of the gentry, it's really just vanity. This all paints a blurry picture of Balbanes. He willingly adopted Delita and Teta when their parents died, and based on Delita's recollection of when Balbanes taught him and Ramza to whistle, did seem to care for them like his own flesh and blood. Ramza and Alma may be bastards, but he is stalwart in his belief that his eldest sons treat them like full-blooded siblings. He clearly loved his children, but of course there is still the fact that he was a loyal knight defending the throne, and by extension upholding a status quo that created groups of haves and have-nots. He had built enough of a reputation that members of the Death Corps knew the name Beowulf as one of the upper class, a name not to trust. But he also only considered one other noble, Count Sidolphus Orlandu, or Thunder God Cid, to be a true friend, and Cid ultimately proves to be the one member of Galtana's court who actually cares about the plight of the common man, much to the Duke's chagrin, and he sees so much of Balbanes in Ramza. That last point helps to cast him in a fair light, but the relative murkiness of Balbanes' character serves as a microcosm of Final Fantasy Tactics' secondary theme: truth. The entire narrative is presented through the lens of discerning it, being framed as a retelling of history with recently uncovered information that had been suppressed for centuries. The scholar who tells the story, Alislam, directly asks the player to join him on a journey for the truth when starting a new game. We can piece together all of the scraps of information we get about Balbanes, probing his sons' and peers' thoughts on him, as much as we like, but all of that information is going to be biased in some way, framed through the speaker's perspectives. Even those who seem like they would have the most authority to speak on him, his children, all interpreted his last words to them in wildly different and conflicting ways. The player, and by extension historians and scholars like Alislam, could only know the Balbanes told in such accounts. The Balbanes of history may not have been who Balbanes really was at all. By contrast, it's from a position of authority that the Church of Globados is able to name Ramza a heretic and suppress accounts of his heroism for centuries after the war. The whole of Ivalice follows the teachings of the Church, and has done for who knows how long, and they have their own knights to hunt down dissenters themselves to prevent the spread of heretical ideas. Ideas like the Church being fallible, or that Saint Ajora, the holy figure upon whom the Church was named and founded, wasn't a prophet. That actually turns out to be true. The Church of Globados aggrandizes Saint Ajora as one who shared messages from the gods, that he warned of a poisoned well on the day he was born, performed miracles, and summoned the 12 Zodiac Braves to save all of Ivalice from a wretched demon in ancient times, when advanced technology was abundant and airships filled the skies. He had accrued quite the following, much to the chagrin of the Edoran Empire and the Farah Church, who were losing followers to Ajora. At age 20, the prophet foretold the imminent coming of paradise, and was branded a heretic by the church in response. One of Ajora's followers, Germanic, sold him out to the Empire, and he would be executed to put an end to his meddling. In retaliation for killing their messenger, the gods sent a tidal wave to the Farah Church's holy city, sinking it beneath the waves. The Church of Glabados would rise in the wake of this. Of course, this is just the official story, the one which was sanctioned and propagated by the church itself, so that the people of Ivalice would willingly defer to them. The truth lies in the Germanic scriptures, which the head of Orban Monastery entrusts to Ramza to keep safe from the Lucavi. While the church upholds Ajora as a hero, a prophet, and a martyr, according to Germanic, he was a saboteur from an enemy nation sent to disrupt the Edoran Empire from within. He did have a religious cult of followers, but the Empire didn't see his church as a threat to their rule. To prevent him from sowing discord, Germanic was assigned to infiltrate his church to gather evidence that Ajora was a spy, so that he may be executed. What he found was that, like in the church's official story, Ajora was attempting to gather the Zodiac Bravestones, a set of 12 legendary artifacts which were carried by the 12 mythical heroes who saved the world long ago, though to what end Ajora was assembling them, Germanic was unsure. The legend of the Zodiac Braves was one already known through all of Ivalice, and the Church of Glabados used this part of the true story to spin their own yarn, saying that Ajora successfully gathered them all to defeat a demon and save Ivalice. Of course, there was no demon, and as time wore on and the church's influence grew, this inconvenient truth would be lost to history. The only remaining first-hand account of Ajora's history would be locked away, and those who read it would lose their faith. Such is what happens to Ramza, as well as Simon, the head of Orban Monastery, who wrote his own notes and thoughts in the book's pages. The only reason he never went public with this information was because he didn't want to lose the monastery and its library. He didn't want to lose access to all of the knowledge available to him. Ironic, then, that he can't share the most important knowledge of all. While it would be easy to look at the framework of a corrupt church that suppresses the truth of its origins while trying to accrue more power and influence over the world as commentary on this or that real-world religion, I think that focusing on such a comparison would kind of miss the point. Like the nobility, the church is trying to maintain or strengthen a certain aspect of the status quo for their own benefit, but there's a hierarchy at play here. At the bottom of the pecking order are the commoners and working class. Above them are the aristocrats, who, while they have their own hierarchy among themselves, largely look out for each other. The Lion War has obviously shaken that up and added a horizontal dimension to it, but above all of them is the church. They are the dominant faith in Ivalice, and hold sway over both the commoners and the gentry. And as the church is slowly corrupted further by the Lucavi, who continue to seek out the Zodiac Bravestones and find suitable hosts, it becomes apparent that organized religion and class disparity are not the sole problems in Ivalice, but rather the self-serving institutions they are a part of or represent. That's not to say that they aren't or can never be problematic, either in the story or in the real world. Matsuno's use of both of them for this commentary was not an accident. But by getting caught up in trivia about how the Church of Glabados may have been inspired by Christianity, or how the Lion War may have some parallels to the War of the Roses, we start to miss the forest for the trees. There are two poignant statements about history that kept echoing in my head as this story played out. History is written by the victors, and history is a version of the past we choose to remember. The former is much more well-known, but they both convey the same basic idea. History is curated by those with authority according to their interests and biases. Anything inconvenient to them can be rewritten, recontextualized, or discarded entirely. And there will always be those who cling to this curated history because it supports some aspect of themselves or their life that they cannot bear to lose. While Elder Simon lost his faith and accepted what was written in the Germanic scriptures, he didn't want to lose his library. The High Priest obviously stuck with the Saint Ajora myth because it was the foundation of the church and the power he had. The gentry, in myriad ways, clung to the belief that they were simply better than so-called lowborns, because how else would they justify their wealth and influence? Of course, when their power and authority to create history and truth are threatened, that's when things get dangerous. There is no diplomatic way of dealing with these institutions when they're built upon maintaining this status quo. The only way to resist is to take up arms. Whereas Yasumi Matsuno's previous efforts were geared for more seasoned fans of strategy games, Final Fantasy Tactics was designed with newcomers to the genre in mind. Part of this is because of Hiroyuki Ito's personal distaste for strategy games, but this was likely also driven by the high likelihood that people would pick it up because of the Final Fantasy name. However, there is still a fair bit of Tactics Ogre's DNA weaved in here. Everything is turn-based, battles take place in an isometric space, there's a light focus on height and elevation, and there's a class system. But the difference is in the details. There are fewer units in battle, with the player able to direct up to 5. Battlefields are much smaller, with all of them being at most on a 16x16 space grid. Because of the power of the PlayStation, they can also be rotated 90 degrees and have the overhead angle slightly adjusted or zoomed out. The ability to engage with the game's job system isn't gated by special items like in its predecessor either. You can start experimenting almost immediately. Permadeath is still a thing, but when a unit falls in battle, they have a grace period of roughly 3 rounds before they perish. And when they do, they can yield treasure or a crystal which fully restores the HP and MP of whoever picks it up. Battles play out more or less how one would expect. Each unit takes their turn one at a time, wherein they can move a certain number of spaces and take an action, such as attacking or using an item. The first 2 battles are admittedly a bit of a poor introduction, with the first, which sees Ramza, Gefgarian, and Agrius defending Princess Ovelia and Orban Monastery from Duke Altana's men, being largely automated. You only control Ramza, who has few options available to him, and the second, which begins the flashback-driven first chapter, gives you Ramza and a handful of cadets to use, with Delita as an automated guest character, again with little in the way of options. These opening battles betray just how interesting the gameplay of Final Fantasy Tactics can get, which is almost entirely due to the new iteration of the job system. As you go through the game and level up the jobs you have, more will become available to you, and like Final Fantasy V, the job abilities you unlock can be equipped to other jobs, except here your options are far more plentiful. You can add the ability to cast black magic, for example, but there are also reaction, support, and movement abilities to equip, such as counterattacks, automatically using potions after taking damage, being able to equip weapons normally unavailable to the current job, and being able to move further or jump to higher ground than usual. Initially, you only have the Squire and Chemist available to you. The former is more or less a basic fighter or warrior job, with the ability to throw rocks and psych themselves up to raise their attack power for good measure. It has some abilities worth picking up early on, namely the aforementioned Accumulate and its Job Point booster. You earn JP whenever you successfully take an action in battle, and they not only act as experience points to level up your current job, but they're also what you spend to unlock new abilities. Ramza's Squire job has some unique attributes, namely having more abilities available to unlock as the story progresses, as well as the ability to learn the Ultima spell in the late game if he's hit by it while he's a Squire. I tried to do this, but because there's no guarantee of it happening, and the only opportunities are intense and dangerous circumstances, I ultimately forwent it. The Chemist may be returning from Final Fantasy V, but unlike its earlier incarnation, it doesn't combine ingredients for wild effects. It's mostly a healing job, being able to throw potions and Phoenix Downs and such to allies from a distance, provided nothing is blocking their path. The Chemist and Squire effectively act as the start of the magic and melee tracks respectively. Hitting level 2 on either of them will unlock 2 more jobs, and at that point you'll be able to start specializing your units. Since experimentation and investment in your units are highly encouraged, I decided to go to the recruitment office so I could make my main units based on my friends. Say hello to PT the Mage, Charlie the Dragoon, Sailor the Dancer, and Bard the Brad. Unfortunately, this plan hit a few snags along the way. While the majority of the jobs here are taken from previous Final Fantasy games, they don't all work in quite the same way, and acquiring their proper equipment is predictably gated by the story. So when Charlie finally unlocked Dragoon, or rather Lancer, as it was localized here, I had to revert him back to a knight to unlock equipped swords so that he could actually have a weapon. Brad just wasn't cutting the mustard as a bard, so I made him a white mage, or priest. The compromise I made for Sailor was a little frustrating, but ultimately proved to be a blessing in disguise. While both Dancer and Bard made a return here, they're the only jobs that are gender exclusive, with only female units able to be Dancers and Bard being exclusive to males. I decided to make him a ninja instead, turning him into my party's glass cannon. He could quickly cover a lot of ground and swiftly cut enemies down with 2 weapons, but he could barely take a hit. It didn't help that his bravery, which determines the effectiveness of a unit's physical power and likelihood of using reaction abilities, was on the lower side, while his faith, the magical counterpart to bravery, was pretty decent. Sure, I could have reworked him to be another caster and recruited someone else to be a ninja, but then I would have had to contend with the most tedious aspect of Final Fantasy Tactics: the grinding. FFT has a bit of an inverted difficulty curve. The early game is challenging, but it eases up significantly as you progress. Enemy levels in story missions aren't ludicrously high, but they're strong enough that you do need to spend some time moving back and forth between battlefields to grind on random encounters early on. Thankfully, enemy levels in random battles scale with the highest level party member you bring into the fight, meaning that there will be more experience, job points, and gil to earn the more time and effort you put into building up your units. However, if you don't already know what you want to do, then the time spent grinding can feel a bit aimless or wasted. Thankfully, pressing the select button on a job, item, piece of equipment, or ability will give you a brief description of it, as well as some stats such as an ability's range and the requirements for unlocking a job. All of the information you need to make informed decisions about your units is available to you, as are a wealth of tutorials that you can access very easily. But even as the difficulty eases up, grinding is still an imperative throughout most of the game. Either because you lost units in battle, which I avoided at all costs, or because you hit some kind of wall, and I definitely hit some walls. This is why it's good to save in multiple slots, as some of the harder stretches where there are multiple battles in a row, with only the opportunity to adjust your unit's jobs, abilities, and equipment between them, could lock you into an unwinnable situation if you save in just one slot. Sorry, Timbly, but you're gonna have to sacrifice your Crash 2 save data if you want to be on the safe side. Because the main series has made a conscious effort since the 5th game to make their story tracks beatable by most players, with hardcore players being catered to with optional super bosses, this level of difficulty feels a bit out of step. It's by no means insurmountable or cheap, and it definitely isn't too complicated, but it can be frustrating being confronted by an enemy that just seems so overwhelmingly powerful, and the only solution is to grind, whether it be to gain some levels or unlock new abilities to try a new strategy. One strategy I kinda fell into was using Flare and Holy on powerful enemies that were giving me trouble. I unlocked them both relatively early on because the level 1 black and white magic spells I was using were still efficient in damage and MP costs, while even their second level versions had costs that were a bit high for the amounts of MP that Brad and PT had. I bought Flare and Holy early because I had a wealth of excess JP for them both, they had enough MP that they could use them once, and I figured it'd be nice to have what amounted to a pair of tactical nukes in my back pocket in case things got dicey. As a result, I never had any trouble with any of the Lucavi boss fights, to give one example. I find the mages in particular to be interesting in FF Tactics, if only for how most of their spells are executed. With certain exceptions like the aforementioned Flare and Holy, their spells don't affect only a single space or unit. They also affect the 4 spaces surrounding them, differences in elevation notwithstanding. This adds an interesting extra layer to your spellcasting strategy, as not only are you able to hit multiple allies with a cure or enemies with a fire spell, but you also have to consider the possibility that an enemy will get up in your ally's face when you're trying to do either of these things, since you could also heal an enemy or hurt your own unit. This also applies to spells like Haste and Slow. It's a small thing, but it's an aspect I appreciate. While most of the jobs in Tactics are returning or slight variations of those from earlier in the series, such as the Beastmaster becoming the mediator and being able to convince enemies to join your party, there is one new job that deserves special mention: the Calculator. With a bit of mental legwork, the Calculator is able to cast magic for free and hit just about every enemy on the field based on their elevation. It's touted as one of, if not the strongest job in the game, but there's not only a learning curve, but a bit of a hump to even unlock its abilities. In my brief time setting Brad to this job, he got to take a turn half as often as the rest of my party, and I reasoned that I was already doing fairly well with him as a white mage, so I forewent trying the Calculator. But the units you get from the recruitment office are not the end-all, be-all of what's available to you. As previously mentioned, the mediator can turn enemies into allies, and early on you come across a chocobo that's being attacked by monsters who joins your party and then will lay a bunch of eggs that hatch into more chocobos that you can ride into battle. You can also recruit monsters who will also lay eggs and make more monsters. But there are also playable special units who join your party over the course of the story, each of which has their own unique skills. But because I had already invested so much time into my own motley crew, I largely ignored them. After a second playthrough, I realized that this was definitely a major contributor to some of the difficulties I was having, but truthfully, I found it extremely satisfying to stick with my core group throughout most of the game, building them up to take on new challenges as they arose, rather than discard them in favor of someone who was more unique. That being said, I did seek out some of the optional special units attainable through some late-game side questing. Worker 8 is an automaton from long ago, seemingly from Ajora's era. He's a tough cookie, but slow and a bit limited. I only used him a couple of times, but he was fun to play with. Beowulf is a knight who I don't think I used at all. Beowulf's fiancée, Reyes, is cursed to take the form of a dragon when we meet her, which I thought was cool, but after the curse was broken, I didn't use her again. Though given the difficulty I had with one particular battle towards the end of the game, I really wish I did. And finally, there's probably the most famous guest party member in the game, Cloud Strife from Final Fantasy VII. I imagine this was a late inclusion to capitalize on that game's huge success, but getting him takes you on one heck of an odyssey. You have to go through the steps to recruit Worker 8, Beowulf, and Reyes, as well as buy a flower from a florist in Zargidus who looks suspiciously like Aerith. Eventually, Ramza will bring one of the Zodiac Stones to Mustadio and Gog, who tries to use it as a power source for an ancient machine that was uncovered, just like they had done with Worker 8. The machine opens a dimensional rift which brings Cloud to Ivalice, and based on his mutterings, it seems like he just bore witness to Aerith's death in his own world. Cloud flees, confused and distressed, but after you've fulfilled certain criteria, he'll show up again in Zargidus to come to the Flower Girl's defense when she's accosted by some loan sharks. Win the battle and Cloud will join you at level 1. Granted, he'll level up fairly quickly, and his equipment brings his HP and MP up to par with where the rest of your party probably are, but he won't be able to use his unique abilities, his limit breaks, unless he has his unique weapon, the Materia Blade. It's not hard to get, just go to the top of Brevenia Volcano with someone who can dig up hidden items. Unfortunately, despite the quick rate at which he gains experience, I didn't use Cloud for much the same reason I didn't really use any of the other special units, though his inclusion is something I personally enjoy. It's fun while also unobtrusive. While I didn't really use these units very much, aside from Cid towards the end of the game because of how disgustingly powerful he was, I appreciate their inclusion for how they enrich the game's story, even though their relevance and narrative presence completely dries up once they become playable party members. Despite this, the wide array of people who join Ramza illustrate how large and diverse Ivalice is, and just how many people are affected by the Church, the Lion War, the Gentry, and of course, the Lucavi. The gameplay options they present are obviously also a good thing. To me, Final Fantasy Tactics' gameplay is its strongest aspect. There was a bit of a learning curve, and it can be very frustrating at times, but overcoming those challenges was always gratifying, and it's complemented by a unique and artful presentation. Final Fantasy has always had a unique visual identity thanks to Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, but like the 7th installment of the main series, Tactics has carved its own path onto the PlayStation. Akihiko Yoshida returned from Tactics Ogre to be the game's character designer, imbuing them with a storybook-esque quality befitting the narrative framing. His rounded faces are kept simple, with large eyes and no noses, while their apparel is not only well-detailed, but makes effective use of shadows to let colors pop, despite how faded and yellowed they are. This aging further feeds into the idea of all of this being a long past chapter of Ivalice's history, and it even persists into a fair amount of the rest of the game's visual design. Menus and text boxes are of a similarly faded parchment color, as is the map. It also isn't uncommon for the background gradients in battles to be in the same ballpark. The in-game visuals are inverted from what Final Fantasy VII shot for. While the latter used 3D models for its characters and pre-rendered backgrounds for its field maps, Tactics uses 2D sprites for all of its characters, who exist in 3D dioramas. This extends not only to battles, but also to the story's connective tissue. Every scene is presented within a diorama, which blurs the line between safety and combat. The main series has had dialogue and other narrative beats play out in battle scenes since Final Fantasy IV, but this commitment to presenting every aspect of the story in the same format is admirable. And while everything is a wide shot, the camera isn't always static. It does move and zoom here and there during these scenes, and this, combined with how these environments are designed and how expressive the character sprites are, makes it all work. Maybe the use of dioramas stems from Matsuno's own childhood love for them, but even if they're just a coincidence, they're a charming and effective way of presenting the story. There's also a distinct lack of FMVs, with only 2 present to act as bookends to the game. The score, composed by Ogre series veterans Hitoshi Sakimoto, Masaharu Iwata, and Hayato Matsuo, is good. It works. I don't really have much to say about it. Not sure how controversial that may be, but aside from some of the battle tracks, the title theme, the map theme, the roster theme, and the data theme, basically the tracks you'll hear the most throughout the game, nothing really stuck out to me. What did stick out to me, however, is the localization. Like Final Fantasy VII, the English script for Tactics is in a bit of a rough state. Once again, nothing is excluded, but there's also still a noticeable lack of quality control. Typos, punctuation errors, and mistranslated names for a large swath of the cast abound here. I'm sure some of you have probably been wincing this whole time at how I've been saying certain names throughout this video. I tried digging up information about Tactics' localization, but unfortunately there wasn't really anything to be found. But really, its worst crime is that it's somewhat plain and unengaging. Not to the point where I checked out of the plot, but it definitely undersells it. But even a good localization probably wouldn't have made up for the Lucavi hijacking the story in the final act. But before getting into the nitty-gritty of all that, I want to emphasize that all of the antagonists in this story crave power. It's what drives them all, and it's not difficult to grasp. As the story unfolds, the Zodiac Stones gradually enter the picture as powerful magical artifacts from a particularly well-known legend. As the legend goes, if you gather the stones, you'll basically be gathering the 12 warriors who saved Ivalice so long ago. The church's high priest wants them basically as trophies, but the leader of the Shrine Knights, Vormov, wants them for more malevolent reasons. As Ramza learns at the end of Chapter 2, the stones can choose suitable hosts for the Lucavi, with most of them being different nobles. The Scorpio Stone chooses Cardinal Draclaut to play host to the demon Cuchulainn, the Impure King, for example. And during Chapter 3, we see a desperate Wygraf, the former leader of the Death Corps who has been conscripted into the Shrine Knights, pledge his soul to the Ares Stone to escape death, becoming the demon Belias. However, the stones aren't purely evil. They merely respond to the desires of those who resonate with them. When Malik lays dying on the roof of Rio Vane's castle, having been stabbed by the Grand Duke who had adopted him and his sister Rafa when their village burned to the ground, one of the stones responds to Rafa's sorrow by reviving Malik, rather than turning either of them into hosts for the Lucavi. There's a lot more going on with the Grand Duke and these two, things that can very easily get this video demonetized, so I won't go into details. It's a bit gratuitous, but it only serves to emphasize just how much of a depraved and power-hungry monster he is. While the stones represent power and possibility, the Lucavi represent a total corruption of those who seek that power. Complete loss of their humanity, subsumed by the demon they sold themselves to in pursuit of it. In that sense, their prominence in the narrative is reasonable, since they're an extension of the themes already at play. But as we move into Chapter 4, which has twice as many battles as any of the previous 3 chapters, their prominence overshadows the Lion War and the classism themes. When Ramza and Alma arrive at Orban Monastery to protect the Virgo stone from the Shrine Knights, they're not only unsuccessful, but Alma is kidnapped by them. The stone reacted to her presence, and as we learn later on, Vormov believes that she may be the chosen vessel for Ajora's return. It's at this point when Simon gives Ramza the Germanic scriptures, the tome revealing the truth about Ajora, for safekeeping. And like Simon, whose notes and commentary litter the book's pages, Ramza loses his faith in the Church of Glabados upon reading it. The Lucavi have Alma, but that's not the end of their business with the Bay Elves. Vormov has sent his right-hand man, Rafael, to begin negotiations with what remains of the late Duke Larg's faction. While Rafael all but states that he knows that Dystark poisoned Balbanes to become the Lord of House Beowulf, as a token of good faith, he gifts Dystark the Capricorn Stone. Zalbag overhears their meeting and finds moss fungus growing around their father's grave, confirming that he died of poisoning. Zalbag confronts Dystark over this, with Ramza arriving at Igros Castle just in time to join the fray. Zalbag even tells Ramza that he was right all along about everyone being manipulated in this war. But upon Dystark's defeat, the Capricorn Stone transforms him into the demon Adramelch. He admits that he killed their father so that the Beowulfs could rule Ivalice, and kills not only his own men, but Zalbag as well. Ramza's unease with his eldest sibling comes to a head, as he has no choice but to kill his fallen brother. Even though I always felt a sense of unease with Dystark even before the reveal that he killed their father, cutting him down to size didn't feel cathartic so much as tragic. His lust for power twisted him long before the stone fell into his lap. Unlike most of the others who sold their souls to the Lucavi, we see a great deal of who he was prior to that firsthand. Ygraf, the only other host we knew for absolute certain we saw pre- and post-possession, sold his soul out of desperation to not die, even if his craving for power and vengeance would have probably led him to do so at some point anyway. We don't know if Elmdor was possessed when we first met him in Chapter 1, but Dystark? His composure hid the conniving manipulator he always was. He was despicable for God knows how long. The stone just made that ugliness impossible to hide. The tragedy comes not from any notion that Dystark fell from grace, since he had no grace to fall from. It comes from Ramza having to put down his brother, clean up Dystark's mess, and mourn the deaths of both of his brothers while also working to try and save his sister. His family is quickly dwindling away. The House of Beowulf is quickly dwindling away, and while one less noble family is no doubt a good thing for Ivalice, something which even Ramza would probably agree with, we've spent so much time with him that we can't help but sympathize. And that's without noting how Zalbag's corpse is reanimated by Vormov to slay Ramza when he infiltrates the church's headquarters in Morand. Vormov has crossed several lines by this point, including murdering the High Priest, the head of the church itself. But it's the third time that he has wronged Ramza on a personal level. He's holding Alma as a hostage, he turned Dystark into a host for one of the Lucavi, and now he's forcing Ramza to fight Zalbag, who despite retaining some semblance of self, is unable to stop himself from attacking. But with his last words, Zalbag apologizes to his younger brother, apologizes for the pain he caused him, for not believing him about there being a nefarious plot. All he asks is that Ramza save Alma, who Ramza deduces has been taken to Orban Monastery, where the dying high priest says Vormov is gone. This confrontation doesn't reframe Zalbag's character, rather it reinforces that he was a man of honor. This isn't a bad thing, it shows that, even to the end, Zalbag held on to his principles. He was misguided, to be sure, manipulated like so many others, but he was given the chance to recant. Had he survived his confrontation with Adramelch, I could see him joining Ramza in his crusade against the Lucavi, but by that same token, if he survived, I don't see him being so willing to give up his noble standing. We didn't really learn much of how he felt about the class divide, but it also didn't really seem to bother him. It's a system from which he benefited, after all. But by this point, that aspect of the story has long fallen by the wayside. The Lucavi still act as an extension of the theme of class division, being corrupted by the power you seek to lord over others, but the basis of it, the actual division between the haves and the have-nots, has begun to get lost in the shuffle. Arguably, the story wraps back around to this at the end of the penultimate battle. With the Germanic scriptures in hand, the Shrine Knights unseal the way to the dead city lying deep underground, the remains of the advanced civilization of Ajora's time. All the way at the bottom is an airship graveyard, where Vormov has brought in unconscious Alma, who he confirms is meant to be the vessel for Ajora. Except in order for him to return, enough blood must be spilled, which is why the Lucavi possessed Shrine Knights. They were able to manipulate both sides of the conflict to spill enough blood to bring Ajora back this way. This is actually a pretty interesting twist, and an ironic one at that. The church is well aware that Ajora was no messiah, so the Lucavi using them as cover for this purpose is, honestly, one of the most diabolical plots I've heard in a long time. Vormov, or rather Hashmalum, the Lucavi who possesses his body, using the church's influence to instigate the Lion War to bring back Ajora, the central figure of their faith who the church knows was a mortal man, is so delightfully devilish. But this still leaves some questions. Why do they want to bring back Ajora? What does Ajora have to do with the Lucavi? And why was Ajora collecting the stones all those years ago? Well, we get those answers more or less on the spot. Ajora was not a holy man, as we already knew, but he was the original vessel for the Lucavi's leader, Ultima, or Ultima as it was localized. With her return, the Lucavi no longer need the stones or human hosts to re-enter this world, and so they can more easily claim it for themselves. Hashmalum kills himself to complete the ritual, and Alma briefly plays host to Ajora. However, likely because she was an unwilling host, the two soon split apart. Ajora transforms into Ultima, and thus the final battle begins, here, among the derelict remains of the world Ajora left behind. At this point in the game, I didn't have much trouble with her. I struggled much more with the fight on the way down that had the 3 Hydras. Again, I wish I had used Reyes a bit. But Ultima is able to teleport to any spot on the battlefield, is able to inflict status conditions on multiple party members, and has thousands of hit points, so it's not as though it's a completely mindless scuffle. By this point, I had already been using Sid a fair amount, and he did a lot of the legwork, but some casts of Holy and Flare also helped to cut her down pretty quickly in both forms. Before trying in vain to keep herself alive, Ultima recognizes that Ramza is a descendant of the person who defeated her last time, a revelation I personally could have done without. It slightly reframes Ramza's place in the world as being much more significant, that he and his family are destined to be slayers of demons and keepers of peace. Obviously, this isn't true given what happened to Dystarg, but it still plays a bit into the divine right of kings crap that the story has been highly critical of. I highly doubt that this was Matsuno's intention. In fact, I'd imagine this was meant to be a nod to the idea of history repeating itself, just as it had with Vormov being possessed by the acting leader of the Lucavi and gathering the Zodiac Stones just like Ajora. So I'm willing to cut Matsuno some slack on this point. With her last, desperate act, Ultima tries to muster up what energy she can to defeat Ramza and the others, but ends up causing a massive explosion. The scene moves to a cemetery, where a funeral service is being held for Alma. Ramza has apparently been denied a proper burial, likely due to his status as a heretic, and the mourners comment on this being the end of House Beelv after 300 years. Olin, Sid's son and one of Ramza's confidants, arrives as the other mourners disperse. He says that Delita, who had become the leader of Goltana's men during the latter days of the war, has married Ovelia and become Ivalice's new king. And just as he wonders whether Ramza and Alma truly died fighting Ultima, he catches a glimpse of the two of them passing by on chocobos, but he's the only one who saw them. The ending FMV shows the last two Beelves traveling together as on-screen text explains that Olin spent the next 5 years creating an account of Ramza's heroism during the war. This document, the Durai Papers, spelled differently than the last time, was set to be shared publicly, but the church, in order to protect their image, named Olin a heretic, just as they had done to Ramza, and burned him at the stake. The church would hold on to the Durai papers for hundreds of years, until Al-Islam uncovered them to share with the world, revealing himself to be one of Olen's descendants. The final scene after the credits shows Delita attempting to gift Ovelia with flowers for her birthday, but she attempts to stab him out of fear that he's trying to kill her like he had done so many others on his way to becoming king. He retaliates by stabbing her with her own knife, before realizing that everything he did during the war has left him isolated. Ramza's gone. He has no friends left. Even his wife doesn't trust him. Like the church, Delita used the premise of a story, one which sees a man go from rags to riches, in order to inspire others as he reached for the throne. His is a true story, of course, and his intentions are noble, but he's given up so much along the way that he's left feeling hollow. It truly is lonely at the top. And it's on that note which ends Final Fantasy Tactics. This was a welcome breath of fresh air to me. Final Fantasy Tactics was an intriguing digression from the main series that not only has its own identity, but feels like more than the sum of its parts. It may be an extension of Tactics Ogre, but the Final Fantasy branding is more than just a name. Its iteration of the series' job system feels like a natural evolution of what was in Final Fantasy V. The Zodiac Stones end up being a fitting analog for the series' crystals. It may be difficult at points, but never so insurmountable that casual players wouldn't be able to reach the end. And it's all wrapped in a story which, while its core themes start to dilute a bit in the third act, is still engaging all the way through. Well, sort of. While I enjoyed the game, as I noted earlier, I did struggle a bit to keep up with the story at points, and this is due in part to the subpar localization. Its plainness left a lot of personality by the wayside, and while the inaccuracies don't break the story, they obviously don't do it any favors. As always, my initial playthrough was with the original PlayStation version, and while I intended to base the main body of this video on that version, I decided to bend this rule a bit after playing what is widely considered the more optimal version of the game. On May 10th, 2007, an enhanced remake of Final Fantasy Tactics, subtitled The War of the Lions, was released in Japan for the PlayStation Portable, with its international releases that October. This version sported a host of balance tweaks, adjusted progression paths for jobs, 2 new jobs, new party members and side quests, an expanded party roster, pre-rendered cutscenes for certain story moments, and, perhaps most importantly, a brand new localization written by Joe Reeder and Tom Slattery, the latter of whom had previously relocalized Final Fantasy VI for its Game Boy Advance release. When I started working on this project, I was told by basically everyone around me who was familiar with Tactics that the PSP version is the quintessential way of playing the game, and I'm not going to bury the lead on this. They were right. Reeder and Slattery's script alone sets this well above the PS1 version for me. I didn't struggle to keep up with the narrative, nor did I ever see the dialogue as simple or utilitarian. It's a bit flowery and verbose, but it's also dripping with character. As Slattery recalled, he and Reeder were in sync for the duration of the latter's involvement in the project. Their vision for what they wanted the script to feel like didn't need to be discussed. They merely checked each other's work as they alternated translating scene by scene. This consistency is maintained through to the end, despite Reeder leaving the project midway through to begin working on the English script for Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings for the Nintendo DS, which would be released in North America in November 2007, just after War of the Lions. One aspect of the English release, which was a departure from the original Japanese version, was the inclusion of voice acting for the game's pre-rendered cutscenes. The scenes themselves are gorgeous, faithfully translating Akihiko Yoshida's simple character designs into living, breathing people, without betraying the original aesthetics and tone that were carried over from the PS1 version. Initially, there were plans to include voice acting in the Japanese version, but according to producer Takamasa Shiba and co-producer Shingo Kosuge, they didn't want to impose their own vision of the characters on fans who played and loved the original PS1 version by giving them voices. And voices would have been unnecessary because they were going to be putting subtitles in the black space created by the letterboxing anyway. I personally don't mind the voice acting, though I'm not sure I would have gone with these voices. They're not bad, just not what I'd have thought they sounded like. I guess I'm proving Kosuge's point here. In terms of gameplay, I have no complaints about the changes and additions that have been made. Reyes and Beowulf got a new side quest building off of what they had in the original release. Delita got some new bits where you actually play as him while defending Ovelia, which, despite not adding much to the grand scheme of things, is an inclusion I appreciate. And I love the new jobs and special units. We have Luso, who joins your party partway through Chapter 3. He's a game hunter, poaching beasts so you can get special items. I didn't use him at all, but I learned after playing that he's from the then-upcoming Final Fantasy Tactics A2, Grimoire of the Rift, and was included here to help promote that game and the wider meta-series both it and War of the Lions are a part of, the Ivalice Alliance. The other special unit, the one who I made great use of after unlocking him, is Balthier from Final Fantasy XII, who makes a cheeky nod to both his iconic "I'm the leading man" line from that game, as well as acknowledging that his presence here is little more than a cameo. While Final Fantasy XII wasn't released under the Ivalice Alliance banner, its then upcoming International Zodiac Job System release was, but despite this, his inclusion wasn't originally intended to cross-promote that version of the game. He was added before Luso, and development of War of the Lions started in late 2005, towards the end of FF12's development. While I can't comment on Luso's usefulness in battle, and personally I think he sticks out like a sore thumb among the rest of the cast, I found Balthier to be disgustingly strong, not because he's capable of dealing obscene amounts of damage, but because his respectable damage output can be done at a long range. His barrage ability makes him even more effective, allowing him to shoot an enemy 4 times with each shot dealing half the damage of a normal attack, and his critical hit rate isn't too shabby either. He and Luso do have one thing in common besides their status as effectively being promotional tools. While they're both from Ivalice, they are from very different time periods. Unlike Cloud, however, their presence here, in this era of Ivalice's history, is never explained. Not that I personally felt like I needed it, because despite getting their own FMVs to introduce them, like all the other special units, their importance and narrative presence becomes nebulous after they join your party. They're here purely for gameplay reasons, and they're highlighted with FMVs for marketing reasons. Is it cynical to say that? Yes, but that doesn't change the fact that I welcome their inclusion. Balthier isn't the only late-game change I embraced, however. The 2 new jobs, the Onion Knight and Dark Knight, had also caught my attention. Both of them have their own unique attributes to unlock or fully utilize them. The Onion Knight is able to be used once you hit level 6 with both the Squire and Chemist, and while it can equip any gear, you can't give it any abilities at all. The way you level it up is by mastering other jobs. For every 2 jobs you master, not including Squire, Chemist, or Dark Knight, it gains 1 job level. Master 14 jobs, and it hits level 8 and its maximum power. I did my best to go as far as I could to power up one of my units to be a good Onion Knight, but unless I was willing to completely break the game in my favor, I wasn't going to be able to max it out. In my PS1 playthrough, I beat the game with Ramza in his 40s. With all the grinding I did to level up the Onion Knight and unlock Dark Knight, I was well into my 80s by the end of War of the Lions. I got the Onion Knight to level 6 by the time of the endgame rush, and she wasn't doing amazingly at that point, so I just cut my losses. The Onion equipment is in the game too, which is what really puts the job over the top from what I understand, but it's only attainable through the new Melee and Rendezvous modes, which are both multiplayer. One is a versus mode, and the other is a co-op mode, and as a result, I had no way to get them. It's a shame, but it is what it is. The Dark Knight, in contrast, doesn't need the special equipment available in those modes to be an absolute monster, but whereas the Onion Knight can be unlocked early but isn't useful until much later on, the Dark Knight requires a fair amount of work to unlock and is immediately useful from the get-go. You have to master both the Knight and Black Mage, and hit level 8 with Dragoon, Samurai, Ninja, and Geomancer. It took some time, but it was well worth it to easily cut down enemies even without its Vehemence ability, which halves its defense but increases attack power by 50%. And its sword skills are not only strong, but self-sustaining. Sanguine Blade restores the user's HP by the amount of damage they deal. I ended up having 2 Dark Knights for a short time, and every time I brought them in, the battle was basically already won. The only real complaint I have about this version is the horrible slowdown that occurs when spells and special abilities are used, which strikes me as particularly odd when similar screen effects are used outside of battle without this issue. Thankfully, if you're emulating this version of the game, there is a fan patch which fixes this, so I suppose it's only as much of an issue as you allow it to be. I said it before, and I will say it again. The War of the Lions is, in my opinion, a much better way to play Final Fantasy Tactics than the original PS1 version. It's even available on iOS and Android, and I've been told that the mobile version is a legitimately good way to play. I think the biggest accomplishment of War of the Lions is how faithful the majority of its changes and additions are to the original. Even Balthier and Luso aren't that out of left field, since we have Cloud as precedent. I bring this up because, while the remake staff was composed of superfans of the original, there was one important figure who wasn't involved in this version at all, Yasumi Matsuno, and yet nothing aside from Luso's outfit feels out of place. None of this is to say I think the original release is bad, just that the PSP version easily supplants it in my opinion, but of course the PS1 version had to walk so that War of the Lions could run.
Inscribe into history. To inscribe into the soul. Final Fantasy Tactics.
Coming off the heels of the mega-successful Final Fantasy VII, and being helmed by a respected creator within the strategy space, it was no surprise to anyone when Final Fantasy Tactics sold over 640,000 copies within its first few days on Japanese shelves, and crossing the 1 million mark in its first month. Famitsu's cross-review panel were pleasantly surprised when they found the game to be much more approachable than Tactics Ogre, while still maintaining its core appeal despite the Final Fantasy flavor. They would award the game a score of 34 out of 40, and each of the 4 panelists mentioned it first among their recommended games that had been released that week. Final Fantasy Tactics would continue to remain on Famitsu's sales charts throughout the summer, clinging to the very bottom of the top 30 in its final weeks, before finally dropping off in October. At that point, it had sold nearly 1.2 million units. The game fared well abroad as well, with the independent PlayStation Magazine praising its premise and gameplay, though criticizing the wide array of characters for making the story difficult to follow. They awarded it a 4 out of 5. Joe Rybicki, in the official US PlayStation Magazine, would also rate it a 4 out of 5, noting that his personal gripes about viewing angles and micromanagement were minor and mostly forgivable. Like in Japan, Western interest in Final Fantasy Tactics was supported by the recent success of Final Fantasy VII, and contemporary reviews would make note of this to inform their readers that the two were not comparable. While Tactics wouldn't see the same level of fervor as FF7, it would still do well. By March 31st, 2003, Tactics had sold a combined 2.27 million units, with 1.36 million in Japan and the remaining 910,000 abroad. By August 2011, that number had only just barely grown to 2.4 million sales. But despite this, Final Fantasy Tactics would be upheld as a classic among fans. Even today, it isn't terribly uncommon to hear some praise it as their favorite game in the franchise, not just out of the sub-series it spawned, beginning with Tactics Advance in 2003 and continuing with Advance 2 in 2007, but the entire Final Fantasy franchise. And the enthusiasm showed when The War of the Lions made its way to North America, where it would be the best-selling PSP game of October 2007, with about 100,000 copies sold, and eventually would become a greatest hits title, though unfortunately I couldn't find reputable sources for further sales information. Final Fantasy Tactics is an interesting pillar of the franchise. Not only is it the most celebrated spin-off title, getting its own sub-series in the 2000s, but Ivalice itself would find its way into the main series. Final Fantasy XII, which was directed by Yasumi Matsuno for the majority of its development, takes place in Ivalice. Vagrant Story, the game Matsuno helmed right after Tactics, also takes place in the same world. And Matsuno himself would be brought back to Ivalice once again for the Return to Ivalice raid series in Final Fantasy XIV's 4.1 patch in 2017. And of course, we can't forget that Ramza was added to Dissidia. All of this is a testament to the richness of that world and the adoration fans still have for it, and the game that gave it to us. And while I don't think I'm quite as high on Final Fantasy Tactics as many others, I can definitely understand the acclaim. I really enjoyed it, despite the frustrations I had with it at times. The War of the Lions was even better. And just recently, investigative journalist Jason Schreier has said via Reddit comment that a remaster of the game is, quote, real and happening, 3 years after its existence was suggested by a massive and largely accurate NVIDIA leak. What this remaster will entail has yet to be seen, but I'm looking forward to it. And while I'm not sure when I'll get around to the rest of the Ivalice Alliance outside of Final Fantasy XII and XIV, I'll certainly keep them in mind for my own time. If only so I can return to this fascinating world. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video to the end. Final Fantasy Tactics was a Patreon goal that we actually hit last summer, but I had placed it on this year's schedule thinking we'd reach it way later than we did. But hey, better late than never. I want to take a minute here to shout out my friend Brad, who's been doing cover tracks for the intros for several of my more recent videos. He just put out a small EP of Tactics covers that I used throughout this video, and I think you should definitely check that out. Also, my friend Connor is turning a D&D campaign he's running into a semi-animated series that's a hybrid of a real play and a narrative play, basically trimming the fat from his group's play sessions and turning it into something more easily digestible. The series is called Feywild West, and you can watch the first episode right now over on the Outlaws table. Links to both of these are in the cards up top, in the pinned comment, and in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and if you liked this video, then do the usual like, comment, and subscribe that everyone tells you to do. And if you really liked the video and you want to help support future projects, then you should definitely consider becoming a patron. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.